The Handkerchief by Great 78. Chapter 36. Into the Woods. Out of the Sinuses. June arrived, and with it their OWL exams. Draco felt that they were going fairly well. Professor Marchbanks, an elderly witch that he'd met a few times over the years whilst at the Ministry of Magic with his father, was wizened and shrunken, but ultimately just as sharp-witted and sharp-tongued as always. In all, his only real mistake had been during the Charms practical examination. He'd overheard the proctor asking Potter if he was the famous Potter. When Draco rolled his eyes, he lost his concentration, and the crystal goblet he'd been levitating had fallen to the floor, much to Potter's amusement. And, of course, with the last names of Malfoy and Potter coming so close together in the alphabet, their examination slots often overlapped. So it was that he was in the room when Potter conjured his Patronus, the multi-antlered stag that had nearly run Draco down on the Quidditch pitch in third year. Potter was such a fucking show-off. He and Hermione sat their Ancient Runes examinations together, and so she happened to be in the room when the horrible silver cat showed up. Apparently, Professor Umbridge did not realize that he was sitting an exam, and would be surrounded by other students who would hear her frantic and annoyed tone.
"Mr. Malfoy, this is the third Niffler this week that has gotten into my office, despite it being locked up. This is unacceptable. My personal belongings are being ransacked. My linens are shredded. The upholstery was ripped from my couch. Half of my kitty cat plates were smashed. I will not abide by this. I will have order."
The entire room, students, professors, and proctors alike, all burst into raucous laughter that was not contained for several minutes. After the exam, he stepped into a nearby convenient alcove, covered by a tapestry. Now that he thought about it, there were a surprising number of alcoves, corridors, and hidden doors covered by tapestries in this castle. He pulled Hermione in as she passed, and when her copper eyes met his silver ones, they burst into fresh giggles, holding each other up as they laughed.
"Merlin, that woman is awful. I would pay good money to see that office," Hermione laughed, wiping tears from her eyes. "I think I swapped 2 rune translations on the test, but I can't even be bothered to care right now."
Draco sobered slightly. "The only problem is, she thinks it's Hagrid doing it, and she's still looking for a reason to sack him."
"But—"
Hermione looked at her watch.
"But Hagrid is teaching a class right now. It couldn't possibly have been him."
"I don't think we're dealing with a rational witch here, Hermione," Draco replied.
"Oh, Draco, I know you don't like Hagrid much, but
actually—" Here he paused, because he still wasn't sure how he should take his and Hagrid's friendship. "He's not so bad. He's got good lessons a lot of the time, in spite of the blasted butt-scroop nonsense."
"Blasted scroot,"
Hermione admonished. "Whatever they were awful," said Draco adamantly.
"But you never know. They could have cured doxy influenza, or their stingers could have been a potion ingredient for a vital—"
She trailed off resignedly.
"No, they were bloody awful."
"Exactly," Draco said triumphantly, then lowered his voice. "And I'm guessing he's told you what he has out there in the forest."
"Merlin, Draco, did you meet Grob?"
she asked incredulously. "Hell no. Who would be stupid enough to go out into the Forbidden Forest with Hagrid to meet another giant?" he asked. She was silent. No. Tell me you didn't. Good Lord, I don't need to worry about Bellatrix getting to you. You'll off yourself if given half the chance." She rolled her eyes.
"Please, don't even joke about that, Draco."
She sighed, anxiety and worry returning as the reality of Hagrid's potential sacking came to roost in her mind once more.
"I've got to go tell Harry and Ron. They'll want to know."
He kissed her fiercely goodbye, reminding her that they were halfway done with the exams, and to go back to her room and rest. A few mornings later, Draco woke to the news that Hagrid had indeed been sacked. Well, really, he'd been chased from the grounds the night before. Apparently, Professor Umbridge and a handful of Aurors had ambushed him in the middle of the night, likely hoping to avoid the public humiliation of Professor Trelawney again. Draco figured that Hagrid must have made his way into the forest to camp with Grop. Several fifth-years had been taking their practical astronomy exams on the astronomy tower and witnessed the entire thing. Professor McGonagall had tried to intervene and had taken 5 stunners to the chest. Draco was frankly surprised that she'd been able to withstand it. She was a tough old bird, that was for sure. Their final examination, the written exam for History of Magic, could not have come with better weather. Outside it was beautiful, the afternoon promising plenty of sunshine. Draco had finished his test and was waiting for the proctor to call for exams. He was daydreaming about swimming in the Black Lake with Hermione when, across the room, Potter tipped out of his desk and collapsed onto the floor. He was hurried from the room by another proctor, whilst students chattered around them in confusion. Draco locked eyes with Hermione, who looked nervous and fearful. After the exam, she'd disappeared. Draco took out his handkerchief and spoke into it. "Everything all right? What happened to Potter?" It was several long minutes until she replied.
"Harry needs to talk to Sirius. He saw a vision of something. He doesn't know what it was, but he thinks that Sirius has been taken by Voldemort to the Department of Mysteries."
Potter had visions. Draco had always thought that nonsense back with Rita Skeeter and Potter being mental was just made up. But Hermione was continuing to write.
"We need to use Professor Umbridge's flu to get in touch with him. She will likely realize it. There's no way she's left her office unprotected, not after all of the Nifflers. Can you keep her away from the office for a little while?"
He replied, "I'll do what I can." It turned out there wasn't much he could do. She had been on to Potter's group from nearly the start. The Weasel had made up a story about Peeves, which she saw through immediately. Apparently Professor Umbridge was beginning to distrust Draco to contact the Inquisitorial Squad, because when Draco reported to the hallway outside of her office to answer her call, the squad was already assembled. What's more, Umbridge had had a couple of new Slytherin members added to the squad, without his knowledge. A stodgy 6th-year girl he thought was named Edwina, and a bullish 7th-year bloke who went by the unusual moniker Ort had come to her call, their shiny eye pins hastily affixed to their robes. Ort held the arms of Luna, and Edwina and Vince were bustling down the hallway towards them, Ginny Weasley and Neville Longbottom being pushed along in front of them. Umbridge herself had Weasley by the ear, dragging him down to her height, relishing in her victory. As a group, they burst into Professor Umbridge's office, finding Hermione with Potter's head in the flue.
"Grab her!"
Umbridge yelled to Draco. He did as he was told, grabbing her around the waist and pulling her to him. He leaned down to whisper in her ear without moving his lips. Professor Umbridge was distracted by wrestling with Potter, yelling at him. "She went around me, got the squad together," he whispered. "I'll do what I can to get you out of this, but I don't know how. I'm going to pass you off to Millie in a moment. I need my hands free in case she attacks someone. Or maybe I can disarm her."
"Okay," she whispered back,
fear in her voice. Professor Umbridge had pushed Ron to Warrington, and had Potter now, holding him by the hair and yanking it so hard backwards that Draco was a bit surprised it had not parted ways from his scalp.
"Disarm them!"
The toad-like witch shrilled at him and the others. The squad all confiscated wands. Draco took Hermione's wand from her pocket, putting it in with his own. Then he made a show of pushing her towards Millie, who roughly shoved Hermione against the wall. Draco clenched his teeth, reminding him to put squid ink in Millie's mouthwash later, or something. Draco took Potter's wand, twirling it in his fingers and tossing it in the air in a pointed show of nonchalance. He needed Professor Umbridge to think he was on her side if there was any hope of getting them out of this. But the woman held Potter in front of her like a shield, and he wasn't sure how he could stun her without getting him too.
Draco, go and fetch Professor Snape!
Draco flung open the door and hurried down the hall to the staircase, taking them 3 at a time. He reached the dungeon classroom door where Professor Snape was just about to lock up for the afternoon. "Professor, you've got to come quickly. Potter was caught by Professor Umbridge. He's trying to get in touch with Sirius because he had some kind of vision or something. He saw Black in the Department of Mysteries with the Dark Lord. I don't know why Professor Umbridge wants you, but she said to bring you to her." Draco finished, out of breath. Professor Snape swept from the room without speaking, and Draco rushed to follow him. Umbridge was incensed. Professor Snape, ever the unhelpful asshole, had failed to give her the Veritaserum she demanded, and had left her to it. Potter tried to give Snape a coded message calling Sirius Padfoot, but Professor Snape played it off as though he knew nothing. Draco honestly wasn't entirely sure whose side Snape was on. He seemed to be working both for and against everyone, but Draco trusted him. Mostly. And yet they were all still here, at Umbridge's mercy, uncertain what the next move should be. Then, unsurprisingly, it was Hermione who came up with a way to get Umbridge out of the picture, and as he saw it developing he was a little in awe of the brilliance of this witch. There was no way that she wouldn't have flourished in Slytherin. First, she pretended to cry. Draco had heard her cry for real before, all those years before in the alcove outside the charms classroom, and this was not the same, not even close. Draco knew she was a good actress from all the times that she'd had to act as though she hated him, and all that practice had been useful. But Professor Umbridge would not care about a woeful witch routine, so he knew she must have an idea. She kept her face purposefully hidden as she came up with her story. They had been trying to contact Professor Dumbledore, she said. There was a weapon, and she and Potter and the others had been told to finish getting it ready. They didn't know what it did or how it worked, only knew how to finish it. And now it was finished. They only needed to let Professor Dumbledore know.
"Lead me to this weapon."
The look on Professor Umbridge's face was decidedly greedy. Draco knew that she was imagining the power and glory she would receive from the Ministry for discovering and harnessing the power of this weapon.
"I'm not showing them,"
Hermione sobbed, pointing around at the inquisitorial squad. He understood. She hoped to get Professor Umbridge by herself. Hermione was a powerful witch, and Umbridge was quite weak without backup.
"It's not for you to set the conditions,"
Professor Umbridge said acidly.
Fine, fine, let them see it. I hope they use it on you. In fact, I wish you would invite loads and loads of people to come and see. That would serve you right. Oh, I would love it if the whole school knew where it was and how to use it. And then, if you annoy any of them, they'd be able to sort you out."
Draco hid a smile. It was perfect. She was playing upon Professor Umbridge's biggest fear, an insurrection. Umbridge decided in her infinite stupidity to outnumber herself, and take to an alternate location Harry Potter, a wizard who had faced down Lord Voldemort himself, and Hermione Granger, the brightest witch of her age. Having read more than a handful of Muggle novels, both Hermione's suggestions and his own finds, Draco knew this was a horrible idea. After the 3 of them left, Draco turned back to the room. "So, how were everyone's exams? Longbottom, what did you answer for number 14 on that History of Magic exam? I couldn't recall if it was Ulrich the Terrible or Ulrich the Gigantic that caused all that destruction. Vince, loosen your grip, I can't hear Longbottom." Draco was pretty much flying by the seat of his trousers now. He had the vague idea that if he could get Ort and Warrington out of the picture, with or without Longbottom's and the Weasel's help, perhaps he could convince Edwina and Millie to stand down. Vince would probably follow his lead, considering that Greg wasn't around, and it wasn't as though any of them truly liked Umbridge. Well, he wasn't really sure about Ort, but he was certain that he'd heard Edwina refer to her as Professor Umbridge before. Draco took Hermione and Potter's wands from his pocket and placed them carefully on Umbridge's desk so that on the chance that some of them could get away, they could take the wands back to Hermione and Potter. Then he turned to the window. He could make out the three of them, Potter and Hermione in the lead, and Umbridge with her wand at their backs, urging them forwards. Hermione pointed into the forbidden forest, and Draco suddenly saw the plan unfold in his mind. She was going to lead her to Grop. Hagrid had shown her where he was, Draco was sure. Grop probably wasn't the sharpest knife in the drawer, seeing as he was still hitting Hagrid accidentally, but Draco knew that Potter and Hermione could protect themselves, and likely knew what they were walking into. Or, at least, he hoped so. Professor Umbridge, Salazar bless her, had no idea, and Draco grinned wickedly. He would give anything to see what was happening out there, under the cover of the trees. Deciding that the rest of the group needed to know where Potter and Hermione were headed, Draco said, "Oh, look, Granger and Scarface are going into the Forbidden Forest. Let's hope they don't get eaten out there." He turned back to the room, just in time to see everything erupt in light and noise, all at once. Turned out there was no need for he and Longbottom to try and take down anybody, because they were doing it without him. Potter's group was acting as a unit, stunning and jinxing left and right. His eyes scanned the room and fell upon Ginny Weasley, who had her wand pointed directly in his face.
"Vespa mucosa!"
she cried, and Draco hated it sometimes when he was proven right. The first time he'd met the Weaselette, years before in the Flourish and Blot's bookshop, Draco had been certain that the witch would cast a mean hex once she learned how, and so she had. Large, furry black bats began to stream from his nose, covered in snot. The feeling of their tiny claws against the inside of his nose was unbearable, as was their jostling and jockeying for position to unfurl their wings. One would get half out, only to be pulled back by another, so that he would have a great big mucus-covered wing flapping against his face, whilst its owner fought for the exit. He could feel them in his sinuses, pushing against his cheeks. Through the blur and haze of wings and snot, Draco saw the weasel grab Hermione and Potter's wands and stomp on Warrington's arm for good measure. Then he grabbed his sister by the hand and yanked her to the door. Neville Longbottom hurried after them, throwing Draco an amused look. Luna picked up her wand from Edwina's slack hand, turned to him and said,
"See you later, Draco. Be certain that you blow your nose after they all get out. Sometimes they urinate when they're upset."
Draco swore, silently, because there was zero chance he was opening his mouth right now. Hermione really owed him for this. Thank you for listening to this chapter of The Handkerchief by Great 78.